Louis Kahn. And my stuff, if you read it, that's fine, but my article about Kahn you really ought to read, even though I'm talking about him again today. Is that okay? It'll probably be only about an hour, because I've got to read them all. Okay? All right, fine. Now, the day talking about Louis Kahn is, I find very strange. I've been talking about him for many years. I knew him very well. I regard him as really the most interesting architect I ever really met, in a way. I knew him since 1947 until his death in 1974. But talking about him now, I realize it's rather strange. None of the architects that we have today, whether it's the neo-modernism or the new urbanism, seems to have anything whatever to do with his design. Nothing at all. The new urbanism doesn't have his abstract geometry and his preoccupation with originality. In that way, he was entirely a modern architect. And the neo-moderns now all go for things that seem to be able to blow away in the wind. All that sense of permanence and solidity, all that concrete and brick that he was interested in is gone. On the other hand, there's not an architect today, I suppose all the way from Andres to, say, Gehry, who doesn't acknowledge Kahn as a great master of architecture. The same was true when he was building. All architects loved his buildings in a funny way. They'd say things like, they're the ugliest I ever saw, but I admire them, I love them, I respect them. And I think the reason for that is that after many false prophets and a lot of high-flying, high-modernist performers, Kahn really did give the sense that he was starting at the beginning. He was starting over. He was starting with basic building, with something fundamental. And also, as I think you'll see from the lecture, he's starting where the beginning of major modern architect began. That is in the 18th century, with Piranesi, with Roman architecture, with the ruins of Rome, with a sense of architecture as embodying the sublime, sense of awe, sense of terror, sense of primitive power. All that was in his work, as you can see in this building at the Indian School of Management at Ahmedabad on the left. And there it was on the right. Can you close the door, please? Can you close the door? Can you close the door? Thanks, sorry, funny, thanks, Renee. Sorry, this is very badly designed, the way that door falls on the screen. There is, you see in the way he is on the left, he was born on a little island off Leningrad of Jewish parents, on a little island that was entirely a Jewish community. They used to, the kids used to gather up coals from the common fire to light the fires in their own houses. And one day when he was about 3 years old, it flared up in his face and burned his face off. So he always was scarred, deeply scarred in his face. And he had bright blue eyes, but slanted like a Tartar. And he was a wrestler. He was short, but he was a wrestler. Great big strong hands. You see him holding his carpenter's pencil, his soft, flat carpenter's pencil with which he used to really lay up his drawings as if he were laying up the courses of brick. And he always said that he wanted to find beginnings. And what he was really against was everything about modern architecture that had to do with pictorial composition. Composition that we talked about with this drawing, this building by Van Doesburg and so on of 1922, where the building has no top, no bottom. It's not built, it's not constructed. It's put together out of an abstraction of flat and weightless planes. It really has nothing to do with primitive structure. And he wanted to turn away from that completely. He despised that. He despised design in that sense. And he wanted to have, as you can see on the left, an absolutely primitive sense of beginnings with the basics of structure. And the kind of structure he did not like was what was going on mainly at that time in the late 40s and early 50s. Like Wayne State University by Minoru Yamasaki is a good example. It's a Mesian shell, really, one volume of space, but then it's all very light, very delicate, very tinselly. Everything that blows away in a hurricane, you see, as you look at it there, is what makes that building with its maximum amount of glass and its tinkling sunbreakers up there on the upper floor, and it's light steel columns. Kahn hated all that. As a matter of fact, if he could, when he could, he wouldn't use glass at all, as you can see on the left. He turned directly against the international style in his preoccupation with glass. And he did turn to the ruins of Rome. And he came to them through that same man that I described last time, who was so important for Philip Johnson. And that is Frank Brown at the American Academy in Rome and chairman for a while of the Yale Classics Department. I knew Brown very well, too, from the time I was a Fulbright in Rome, which was a year after Kahn. Kahn was there from 50 to 51. I was there from 51, 52. And Brown was an eye-opener and made us see Roman architecture as no one had ever made us see it before. His favorites were austere, with brick and concrete construction like this, and in the ruins, you see, with no glass, and with the lintel, originally wood. There, Kahn has his lintel, and he turns it around. He has it holding the relieving arch together. All of that comes from Rome and from Brown. And it also comes from his schooling, which was in the Beaux-Arts. And the man he learned the most from when he was young, before he went to the University of Pennsylvania, was George Howell. George Howell was a Beaux-Arts architect who later became a modernist and designed the PSFS, as you remember, I talked to you about before. And this is a house he designed in 1925 in the outskirts of Pennsylvania, and you can see he's got a cylindrical tower made apparently of rough rubble masonry, and the window is so designed that it can be completely removed. So you have the dark void without glass in the basic primitive brick structure, and that's what you've got over here on the right. And then Kahn went to the University of Pennsylvania, and he studied with the great French architect Paul Cret, who I've talked about already. And he took a trip during that in 1928, went to Europe, and he sketched what he saw. And here he is with his carpenter's pencil. You can see him laying up the masonry courses at Assisi, and you see it's the same kind of architecture that he's going to do later. It's without glass, it's a ruin, it's a deep void, a deep black void in a primitive structural mass. He also did, like a lot of Beaux-Arts architects at that time, he did watercolors. He never let anybody know it later because modern architects never did watercolors. They were supposed to belong to the effete old period. But later they turned up late in his life. Here's a watercolor he did near Sorrento, and it's of a fisherman's house, and it looks sort of Art Deco in its forms, but again you see it's a solid masonry structure with black voids in it and without glass. Now it's interesting that what you might call the high-style architecture that he was being taught at the University of Pennsylvania by Paul Cret, and buildings designed by Paul Cret while Louis Kahn was working for him in his office in 1928, like the Federal Reserve on the right, which wasn't built until 1934, but it's designed in 1928. You can see it's like this. It's classical, and it's bright, but it is abstracted, heavy, massive, and the glass is almost eliminated. You can hardly see it. The glass is treated as simply black voids in a very solid mass. On the left is the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington of 1929. But they're both designed by Cret while Kahn is working in his office in 1928. And you can see they have that same character, and they're very massive. And this kind of architecture was called stripped modern, or modern classic. I talked to you about that before. And it's what Kahn grew up with. It's what he liked. It was close to him. So when, in 1929 to 1931, the Villa Savoye came along, Kahn, all of a sudden, like everybody else, couldn't do that architecture anymore. He said, a curious, wonderful remark he made, he said, I came to live in a beautiful city called Le Corbusier. And now everything had to be light, everything had to be linear, everything had to be abstract, had to be pictorial, and you just couldn't do symmetrical. It's hard for you to realize at this age what a block that was in the minds of students. You could not do symmetrical architecture in an advanced architectural school in the 1940s, say, for example. You couldn't do that anymore. Now, one reason was modernist style, like Corbusier, but the other was the fact that not only the United States, but also fascist Italy and Nazi Germany used basically stripped modern architecture in their buildings of the of the 1930s, the high period of totalitarianism. And in Rome, Mussolini gave up his flirtation with modern architecture, which he had very strongly, and turned to Brazzini and Piacentini. And at the University of Rome, you have an exaggerated version of the Paul Craig, same kind of thing. Well, that immediately made it, for modern critics, you couldn't do it. That was fascist. Only the fascists would do that. If you did anything like that, you didn't belong in modern architecture. It's even worse with the Nazis. A lot of good scholars have made us see how good a lot of fascist architecture was in Rome, and it certainly was haunting, as we'll see later, as Rossi understood. But even Krier hasn't been able to make us realize that what's his name, Speer, was a great architect. Whatever the case, if the Nazis did it, as here, you just couldn't do it. So that Kahn, when I knew him, I met him in 1947, he was doing drawings like this, which were absolutely counter to his nature. See, there's no mass, there's no block, it's all glass, it's all thin, tiny lally columns, it has no weight, it has no presence, it's no there. And he didn't feel at home in it, and he wasn't very good at it, as you can see there. And when he came to Yale, 47, his hair was still red, his face was burned, his blue eyes, he looked like Harpo Marx. Notice he's making an absolutely symmetrical gesture. I've seen him at the blackboard with 2 pieces of chalk, able to do absolutely symmetrical arabesques with both hands. That's Beaux-Arts drawing, that's the French Beaux-Arts drawing, that's what he was taught by Paul Craig. You can really feel it there. But he lost his whole basis for work. Everything he'd known was gone, and he was talking about order all the time. Like a lot of people, architects and art historians as well in that period, right after the war, he was turning to science. He wanted science. He wanted crystals, the science of crystals. Maybe that's the way he could do it. He was looking, and he couldn't find it. Then, luckily, he became a fellow at the American Academy of Rome in 1950. So he's there in the year 1950-51. And right away, it's as if he goes to what he needed, like a starving man to food or to water. He goes to a mixture of St. Peter's Square and a major work by Mussolini, the Foro Italico, on the left. And you see, he does this drawing, and he does it now in pastels, which is as close as you can get to watercolor, but it's not watercolor, it's not that effete watercolor anymore. It's easier to walk around with and carry in a knapsack than watercolors, so he just starts to work in pastel. And you see, you can imagine yourself at St. Peter's, you're back to the cathedral, you're looking out at the steps and at the building on the right that closes the space, and you have a statue on a plinth, but then it changes. And you don't have St. Peter's Square behind it. Instead, you see you have these buildings of the Foro Italico and a truncated obelisk like this one, and you've got even more similar to this, these plinths and the sculpture and the stairs, and the two merge. It's the Rome that he knew, the Rome of the Pope and the Caesars. It's exactly the Rome he'd known in 1928 when he made his trip. And it's something also, of course, which brought him very deep into the Italian feeling about form at this period. I mean, if there's one man that shaped it, of course, it's Giorgio De Chirico. And De Chirico, as you remember, was a young architect, a young painter, who was isolated. He was in France during World War I. He couldn't get back to Italy. He did these haunting scenes at that period of Italy as he remembered it. Old Italy with the colonnade, New Italy of the politicians on their statues with the things on it, the chimneys of urbanism, all of that there in that heavy Italian light, that melancholy late afternoon Italian light. And it's you see that influence of De Chirico and of people influenced by him like Eugene Berman and so on, shapes the way Kahn closes it, uses the shadows, and so on. It's connected with that. And as I say, the fascists had been pretty good at evoking that melancholy. They did turn to the Roman city. That's one reason they were able to outdo the modernists in Mussolini's mind. The modernists couldn't build, I'll show you later, couldn't build buildings in the middle of cities. They didn't feel like that. They didn't think that way. Whereas the fascists picked up the tradition of Italian urbanism. You got a place like the EUR, which was settled. It was going to be a big exhibition in 1942, the Esposizione Universale di Roma, When Mussolini was otherwise occupied in 1942, they never had the exhibition, but it got finished after the war, hated by all modern architects as a symbol of fascism, but almost one of the most popular places to live on the outskirts of Rome at the present time, because it's a really great spot. It's a wonderful place. And you see, you look down toward what was the building of Italian culture, you notice it has no glass. It's wide open arcades on both sides. And you have that haunting quality, that same light. And that's what Kahn was beginning to plug into. This is what he knew, this is what he loved when he was young. And he goes, I wonder, can I get it darker? Any of you know how to get this thing darker? It's getting bright again for some reason. It's not. I had it darker than this before, didn't I? There. Good. That was like that. That came back on by itself, didn't it? The place is haunted. It's poltergeistic. Anyway, he travels around Italy. In the fall of 1950, he goes to Siena, and look what he gives up in order to get what he wants when he looks at the Campo. You see, everything that gives it intermediate individual scale, like windows, gets rid of, or little booths for the merchants, all that's gone. And there are the towers of the cathedral beyond. He makes them green against the green sky. And there's red brick, but he makes it blood red. And the Campo is tawny as it goes down, but he makes it bright yellow. So the whole thing is abstracted. It has no scale. It's imminent. It's melancholy. It's almost threatening. And it's what he finally comes to be able to build. Here is a Dhaka toward the end of his life. That's a three-level, three-story building we're looking at, but you'd never know it. He wipes out any sense of scale. It's bright brick. It's reflected in the tank in front of it. It seems to bleed down the way the red bleeds down into the Campo there. And that's exactly what he's after. That's what he sees here for the first time. It's what he comes to believe in. And I might say that Rossi is touched by this too. Rossi has criticized Kahn often, as I'll mention later when I talk about Aldo Rossi. But he picks up from him that Italian palazzo, the De Chirico-esque paintings, drawings, the red palazzo that has no windows, no doors, and then beyond it you see the towers of the Santo and so on, the towers beyond it in the greenish sky. There's a lot between those two that's similar, and Rossi picks up, takes away from the fascists what they had. He takes back the Italian place, the Italian city, and Kahn is important in that. Then, as everybody did at the Academy, in the second term, after Christmas, he traveled. And he went first to Greece. And he went to Delphi. And you notice how he paints that view from Delphi down to Atea, the little town on the Gulf down there. Hot. It looks like someplace in New Mexico. Hot colors, terracotta colors, blacks and whites. Not at all Greek. I mean, here's a photograph taken actually by me in 1955, not knowing anything about that drawing, from the same place. The natural place. And that, while naturally colors changed over the seasons and over the day, the light in Greece is generally silvery and white, as on the left. He makes it, he's looking for something else. He's looking for something hotter, more like the desert that he's after. The same thing is true when he goes across the Gulf to Corinth, and he does the great Temple of Apollo, which is made up of single blocks of stone, not things so, which stands out there against the mountains that are over there toward Delphi. But again, that's not the color there. The color is more like this. You see, it's exactly the same place, exactly the same view. You get the same thing, those wonderful monoliths of those columns. No emphasis, no swelling, high or low, solid, immovable. Apollo is the hoplite, the warrior standing there. Kahn loved that, but he wasn't. See, he wants also a sky that's got more white in it, and he wants it not that silvery, bright white, but he wants orange. And then he goes to Egypt and he finds it, because those are the colors of Egypt. The sky of Egypt is bright blue, but it's almost always full of sand, really, and deposited up there. So it's a whitish tone of heat that you get up there. And then you get down here or rather up there to Luxor and Karnak, and he does one of the temples, and you have great big fat vegetable columns standing in front of walls, and they're the same quality he's been looking at all the time. They are like that. They are that color. They are that orange, that heavy, warm vegetable color that you have there. Now, it's interesting, when he traveled in Egypt in 1951, they were still at war with Israel. And he couldn't, being a Jew, he couldn't travel there. So he had his passport stamped Episcopalian. He didn't look very Episcopalian, but nevertheless, he had it stamped Episcopalian, and he traveled there under that name. But something about Egypt unlocked his Jewishness, as well it might. And he'd never been practicing or anything like that. But then when he comes to design what would have been one of the greatest synagogues in the world, the Mikveh Israel Synagogue in Philadelphia, later never built, you can see it's really this. It's the round columns, big, that stand in front of the wall in that main building you see on the right. Now the difference is those columns have turned into hollow, big hollow cylinders, which stand around the main meeting place up there. And it's according to the covenant, if you only have a few people, they can meet in one of those small chapel spaces. Otherwise, they fill it. 10 men or 1,000 can start the ceremony there. And he sees the light coming through there. Those hollows are also vehicles of light. The light comes through the outside, is filtered by them, and then comes through in this kind of magical way, kind of supernatural way. These lights up in space come out and light this thing. And I think the reason that he never was able to build this was he couldn't figure out how to get glass in those things. Imagine the problem getting glass without ruining it with the muddying and everything else. It has to be the ruin with the hole in it. As soon as you get glass, as soon as you start fiddling around with that frame, you lose it, and it was never built. But you see what this is. This is the ultimate Jewish image. This is from the so-called tree of the Sefirot, which you see on the right. You see he uses almost exactly that confirmation. Now the tree of the Sefirot is made up of the names of God as you find them in Jewish teaching called the Kabbalah. And the Kabbalah is a mixture of Jewish mysticism, old rabbinical traditions and studies of the Bible, and Greekish Neoplatonism of the late antiquity. And it comes out into the Middle Ages, and it's influenced by Christianity. It brings in elements from Christianity. And this is a book of the late Renaissance, in which you have that perfect shape right there. And they're supposed to be shapes of light. And they're the names of God, like victory and kingdom and wisdom and splendor, and all those words are there in those lights that you see there. And Kahn goes to that. Now, he buys books all the time, but he really doesn't read them. He looks for pictures. He's an architect. Sometimes he reads, but not much. He never talked to me about his Jewish interests, but he did to his Jewish friends, and he compartmented his life. As those of you who've seen his son's movie realize how compartmented his life was. But in any event, you can see he's touched by this. Now, light, supernal light, is what makes that image. And right at this time, Kahn starts talking about light. But he also talks about something else all the time. So light is what's important for architecture, but he also has silence. Now, silence is not typical of the Kabbalah. Jewish contemplation involves praying all the time. Keep talking all the time. But it is Christian. You find it, for example, in San Marco in Florence, where Fra Angelico paints St. Dominic, who is enjoining the psalmist not to sing the wrong tone. Better not to sing at all, better to be silent, to call up God through absolute silence. So the sense of silence as being the immanence of divinity, along with the Kabbalistic light, is fundamental to Kahn. And finally he goes to Giza, the last stop he makes there, the fundamental stop, first and last when he goes to Greece. And he writes a little poem about the pyramids, and he calls them the sanctuary of art, which sounds strange, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And then he says, of silence and light. Now the light is really what he sees there, and is magnificent. If you think of a pyramid has 4 sides. But when you look at it, unlike a cube, your mind does not supply 2 others but 1. It turns into a tetrahedron. Somehow the way the plane goes up and disappears at a point, you don't get the idea of 2 others. Similarly, you can see how it's all light. On one side it's in darkness, the other side it's in the sun. In antiquity, as you can see in the first pyramid a little bit, they were sheathed with blinding white limestone. And they were above what is now Cairo. And the sun rose in the east. the Sphinx is pointed directly at it down below. And when it rose, it hit these, and the rays of the sun just blazed across Egypt, across that central heartland of Egypt right there. And that's the image of the sun god Re. And these are aimed like the pyramidion at the end of a missile. They're aimed to the sun, so that the pharaoh will get, it's all light. And he does wonderful drawings which show that. See them up there? On the one hand, it reflects the desert sand. On the other hand, it's in the shadow. On the other hand, it's in bright light. So he sees them like this. Then while he's there, he hears that he's been chosen to build the new art gallery at Yale University. And he goes back, and eventually, as he builds it, he builds his wonderful slab, his tetrahedral slab, out of three-sided, pyramidal, but not four-sided shapes up there. And they contain the light, and they contain the other utilities in them as well. So if you look on the right, you see it's as if he takes the pyramid, this solid mass, and he turns it into a tetrahedron. It starts off as a space frame, and I think you can see that the beams that are going that way are thicker. And that was not Kahn's choice, but the engineer was a little afraid of somehow, I don't know exactly what, but it looks like a tetrahedron, and it's based on these, and the light is there. Now, it's also a condensation. I've talked about that before, because these are the geodesic dome shapes that Buckminster Fuller makes. And Buckminster Fuller had just come to Yale and had the students build a cardboard dome on top of the architecture school. And Buckminster Fuller, you know, would come, he's a short man, big head, big shoulders, very short legs. He would sit on the edge of a table, kicking his legs, and talk for 8 hours at a time. And he would literally burn out students' minds. Students at that time, 1949, were looking for a way, they were looking for an answer. It was pitiful. We'd forgotten all about architecture, as Andrew said the other night. And some of these people never outgrew that, never got past Bucky Fuller. People who could never do anything in the rest of their lives but geodesic domes. And those are, after all, a very limited application in architectural practice. He destroyed them. He really destroyed them. And Kahn would never have anything to do with it. He knew him well, but he didn't like his work very much. But he had a woman in his office named Anne Ting, by whom he also had a child. And she was a devotee of Fuller. She kept after him, do it like Buckminster. So really you might say the two were there, but he would never have touched those shapes if it hadn't been for the pyramids, I'm sure. And it gives the whole thing, it's the most remarkable building at Yale. It's the greatest modern building without any question. This great primitive, but again, you see, it's like as if he got his wish about crystals up there. And here it is in 1952 and 53. Now here, of course, is Mies, who I've already talked about. Though that Mies building is later, it's 1958 at Houston. There's that Mies world where the figures are just in no threat at all. It's just space around them. But there's a hardness, there's a toughness, and the works of art seems to me take an intensity almost as if they're under threat from the real physicality of that great primitive slab overhead. Now it's sad that no sooner was it built, and Kahn, everybody wanted Kahn to be the new dean of the architecture school, but he wouldn't do it unless the president would guarantee him a building. For a number of reasons, the president wouldn't do that, so Kahn wouldn't take the job. Instead, we got Rudolph, and Rudolph no sooner came than he was blindsided by the new director of the gallery, not the one who commissioned this. The new director, who didn't like this, came from the Museum of Modern Art, and he got Rudolph to ruin it, like this. If he could have covered the slab, he would have too. But you see, he took out all that, to a great big space with these pogo panels, as they call them, standing in it, and this great slab like the sky overhead. And Kahn never talked to Rudolph again. Rudolph just didn't know what he stepped into. Kahn never spoke to him again. And later in life, he said he would ever design anything like this, which is one big open space you see under that canopy, supposed to be a space frame. He'd never design anything like that again. He'd have a small bay system, so nobody could get in and completely change it. And he did do that in this last building right across the street in the British Art Center, finished at the time of his death in 1974. Now this building is a very odd one too. The idea that it would be a big Miesian rectangle was decided before Kahn got back to the United States. And Kahn then inserted this great slab. He was always sorry that the building couldn't become rectangular like the slab. I think that would have been a bad idea, but nevertheless, that's what he wanted. And so the building is very strange. If you see it from the courtyard, which is above there, oh, sorry. It's really very beautiful. It's a wonderful court lifted up. And you can see how the building is at those major spaces, and then the servant space in the middle, where you have the circular staircase and the plan. Yeah, it's very clear what it is. And when you get closer, down below in that little notch there, you can see all the great tetrahedrons inside. On the other side, however, toward the street, which is down here, he at first didn't know what to do. He had to close it against the street, he thought. And indeed, this is his first drawing. You notice he doesn't even have the slab. He has Corbusier flat slabs, and that's before he really fixed on the slab. But then finally, when he has the slab, he has it worked out, he yields to everybody's pressure to indicate the floor levels with string courses. Didn't want to do it. But he rationalized it as it being, and of course that helps it a lot. I mean, that gives us some of that character now on the street that an Italian palazzo has with the string courses. It has an urban presence, more willed and clear than the other one, which is just abstract. Now you see the way it relates to the individual building. That's why it gets narrower there at that point. So you'll go in at the side. It's really very good, instead of trying to have another entrance right there. Because what he's doing, he's adding on to this building you see here. First, on the far right, you have a building of 1870. Then you have by Addison Swartwout of 1928. And you see it's a wonderful, big, Romanesque to Gothic building that was supposed to go all the way to the corner. And some people even today think it would have been better if Kahn had never been able to build that the building really had gone to the corner. Kahn meets it, and when he meets it, let's see like this. You see, he sets it back. So his thing has an interject and not just a continuity of it here. You get this wonderful sequence of buildings that then go down. It's finished by Rudolph with one of his best sighting jobs of all, was right on the axis of the sidewalk, whap, like that. And where the Kahn building, you see, is just a cut-off box. The Rudolph lifts and receives it in that great big gesture. It's really great. And it's the greatest bunch of buildings at Yale without any question. But Kahn wasn't happy with it. He was still working. The thing he liked best was that stair hall. Well, in fact, I almost lost my life before the railings were there. I came out on the top floor and I looked up at this, and this so entranced me. Here's the pyramid floating upside down above you, flat and black against the sky. I almost went off. Normally stairs go off to the right, if you ever noticed, but no, I started to go to the right and it wasn't there. It was the other way, but anyway. Okay, but it's wonderful, and it is that silence and light that he saw in the pyramids. However, as I said, he left Yale when Rudolph came, and he built already in 1955 his own pyramids, his own silence and light, in the little Jewish bathhouses in the Jewish Community Center in Trenton. This was a great big project, but they built only the little bathhouses, cheapest and most primitive materials, cinder block and shingle and so on. You see what you've got. He builds now a four-sided pyramid, a real pyramid. And indeed, he has four of them around a central space. Four of them over squares. So you have squares. It's like a Corbusier demonstration of the basic geometries. You've got the square, you've got the pyramid, and then you've got the circle. And you've got the square and the circle in plan. And there, it's Louis, he's starting to get back. And Wittkover had just written his Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism. And Kahn, again, didn't read it, but he looked at the pictures carefully. And you see what you've got there. You've got the basic image that they focus on, which is this basic image of the square and the circle perfectly drawn. And there with Kahn, it's only drawing. It's only a rough little building, but it does connect him in a way with what he'd always been trained in, this whole French tradition of gardens, the circle and the square, the abstraction of the landscape, all those things we talked about before. And with other things too, with a tradition which is Beaux-Arts after all, starting right at the time of the Revolution, with Durand and the others, where you have served spaces, which are the big ones, and served spaces, which are the small ones. And that's the way he works it here. He's got the small spaces, he tries to shove the Johns in them, and the structures inside. And it makes that the served spaces serve the big ones. And that, again, is in connection with everything he was taught in history at the Beaux-Arts. For example, Viollet-le-Duc So Saint-Front and Périgueux, for example, you see you have, it's almost like this. You've got 4, 5 squares. There you have a dome above each one, so you have a circle above each one. And then you have pairs of columns in 4s, which make the ambulatory all around, serving space to the big spaces. And that's what he's got there. Now that's important, because that's what he uses when it comes to build a building that made his fame, really, all over the world. And those are the Richards Medical Laboratories at the University of Pennsylvania, from 1959 to about 1962. You see, he gives up the circle, but he's got the laboratories as squares. And the squares are served between the great big structural sections, which you see there. See those concrete beams, columns coming up. He has stairways and ducts that take noxious air out of the laboratories. And you see the ducts there, and you see the stairways over there, and then he shows each of those on the outside. He expresses them. He encloses the stairway because it goes all the way down, but he shows you at the bottom that it's not bearing. But the ducts, he has more, as they go up, you need more ducts as you have more levels, so he has them growing out of the side of the building, so the whole thing looks as if in process of work. Now, this is almost the fulfillment of a modern dream, which almost never worked, that you make a building from a pure analysis of function and structure. And that's what he's got here. And the British saw this, and right away, 2 of them came who've been very important since, Norman Foster and Richard Rogers. They both came and studied at Yale while this was in construction, and they heard about it at Yale, and they went down there, and they met Kahn, and they were at that time just developing archigram. Now, this big British movement, archigram, climaxes in 1962, when Ron Heron and the others put together the first show. And you see, this is a drawing out of the first show. You see what they want. They want a building that looks, it's in process. It's an expression of the structure and everything else. It's what comes out later in Pompidou, basically. And you see in the profiles up above, he clearly has Kahn in mind here. So that they see this as a precursor of archigram, as I suppose it was. But then Kahn disappointed them all, and they turned on him. The British may do when they get angry at you in a critical way. They really go for you, the way people rarely do in the United States. Because what he did was throw out that funny thing. I burst on this, and it's eerie. He threw out the expression of the ducts like that, and he clad everything right to the ground. So the British said immediately, you can't tell what the structure is. They look as if they're holding it up. And even though you do see the columns, the precast columns next to them, they don't look as important as these. So they made fun of it in the Architectural Review. Nasty review by a man named Rainer Banham came out the very day that Kahn mounted the platform to get the gold medal of the British Institute of Architects in London. It was calculated for that moment. Probably the most vicious, critical thing I've seen in any event. What Kahn had him, see, what clearly touched Kahn with these watercolors he'd done at San Gimignano back in 1928. This is San Gimignano. Now, why would he do that? Well, he said it was easier to construct, but I'm sure that wasn't the reason. I think it was because, my own view, I can only extrapolate from my own experience, I think the building was beginning to get to him, because that's a hard building. That's medical laboratories. That building is full of crying dogs. Down there are people in Kahn's office, and me included, though I wasn't in his office, who couldn't go in the building for a long, long time. It's wrapped up like this, all the guts out. It's horrible, believe me. And it's a dark place of pain. And, it looks like it. And laboratories we think of as, antiseptic and things, but they really are where mankind struggles at the expense of all the rest of the animal kingdom to stay alive, no matter what, at the cost of no matter what. And you feel it there. And there is also the brotherhood of these dedicated sciences there, like the brotherhood of a town, the competition, the toughness, the hardness, the darkness. Anyway, that's what he catches there. Now, it's a big tragic view for laboratories, and they never liked it very much. But it is a wonderful structure. It's all precast, as you can see. No mortar. So Kahn said, I began to feel that the crane was an extension of my arm, and each one of those was like a brick that I just put in place, locked like that. Now that kind of structure, he'd also been taught by Paul Cray, and with people like Auguste Choisy, who writes his Histoire de l'Architecture in 1893, And it's the history book that Kahn used. And you see, he loved to make these worm's eye view of things like Greek temples, which are put together this way. They're put together dry, no mortar, of dry pieces of wonderfully cut stone, not concrete, but the same principle. You can see it there. And that's the way this is put together. And the best quality is when you get that square like that and you see the whole structure and it's so tight and it's so taut. But it's square, each of those laboratories. It wasn't big enough. They wanted more open space inside. There was no sun protection. You can see people putting up silver paper in these things. So when he added to the back of this building, and you see the stair tower way back there, you see it, you're looking at it, it's up there on the right, on the other side of it. And he adds this bunch right along here, as you can see, from the earlier group which is over there on the right. And he fiddles with the slabs in a way I don't like. I don't like it as well as the other ones. Not as taut, not as tense. You don't feel it locked the same way. But he wanted to conclude the building with a library. And he designed a library where you see each one of those squares is lighting into 2 cubicles. And there's a wall between it. Down below, there's a light that goes into both books on both sides. The light goes on the book. The major light above is above your eyes, so it's not blinding you. And it's great. It makes a nice kind of cornice to the building. But in the building, they left out the library. There is no library. So everybody said, Louis, what are you doing? It's supposed to grow from function and structure. Here you've got a mythical library. So he really thought he should systematize the thinking. And he really did right away when he came to build the Unitarian Church in Rochester, New York, in the mid-60s. And this is when he works out his theory of form and design, which I think is a pretty solid way of the way the mind really does work. You know, the modern view was you have a problem, you make diagrams of it, and then you slowly arrive at the form. Kahn says, no, when you get a problem, the architect thinks of a form for it right away. There's a form in his mind that he goes to. And then that form should be bombarded, that ideal form, should be bombarded by the realities of the functions and so on of that situation. They should be bombarded by design. So you have form and design. And it goes like this. He says, see, he thought his first idea was a school. The big room in the middle should be served by the Sunday school. So he has a circle and square. That's the form in his mind. It couldn't be more basic. And he does the first form drawing with everything the same shape around that central space. And then he says, you then bombard that with the fact that these rooms need to be different shapes, for example, and you get this, and if it holds, you deform it, and if it holds, you build it. And he says a good example is the people who were running the school had the wrong form idea, the wrong form in the mind. They saw it like one of Breuer's binuclear houses, school here, but he says no, because all the parts of the school want to be close to this big room. So they all want to be like this. So that was the wrong form. This is the right form. And it created a beautiful plan. You watch that one deform into this. It's really wonderful. The big, long entrance space, the library, the kitchens, the classrooms, they all have different shapes around this great space here in the middle, which is lighted from above by those monitors that come down through here. Notice how those monitors light this narrow corridor here, as well as the main spaces out there. And he says with this, it's really wonderful to watch it develop. He says a man with a book goes to the light. He should have said a human being, but nevertheless. And you go right here, where is the way you start down below. You're looking at this view from that way. And you come in here, say, and you sit there, you see it right here, and the light comes in from here, it falls on your book. So that gives you the first floor level, like this. Then he says as you go up, you want the glass behind to be shielded from the sun. So it's back by those flanges. Then the big monitors are rising behind it, where you have the great space, which is this. Now this space is wonderful. Imagine, see, you've got these 4 columns. They go up, and then they have the other columns that come down next to them here, and they're holding up this slab, which is dark above your head, and is flying up like a great stingray above your head in the water, up above you like this, and the light is coming down, and it's just cheap cinder block, but it's made noble with this silver light that comes down. And imagine, you see, here, these are in the wall, but there's a thickness there there's a corridor. Imagine that corridor's like. And then you come in through this little door, and you're in this great space. But everything is taut and silent. Silence and light. And you really feel in that space, I feel at least, the imminence of divinity. You could just feel divinity striding hard, strong, demanding into that space, and with that wonderful light. And then all that's expressed on the outside. And you say, well, you've got really the ultimate modern building. You've got a building that really grows out of the analysis of structure and function and light and its protection of the building from light and the reception of light. But that's not the way he liked to have it show, because he didn't like to have the glass show, where it does up there. So when it was first published, in Bob Stern's great double perspective issue of 1965, this is what he liked, like this. And you notice, you see it over there, you don't see any glass. That's what he wants. He wants to subordinate the glass. Now, it's right about this time he gets the commission from Jonas Salk to do his laboratories for biological research in La Jolla, near San Diego, as you know. And I show you the finished form here. You'll notice how you really don't notice any glass. There's some glass up there in the studies that are near us. They're surrounded by wood right there. There's glass back there. But you don't really, it really looks like it's a concrete structure of concrete slabs put together with pure voids in between them. And what you're looking at there is what Salk wanted, which is places for the studies. The people were supposed to come and visit here and be visiting scholars, and they would each have a study. You see the study. But the big laboratories behind them, and there Kahn wanted to solve his problem, which he didn't do. Solve the problem is a very modern term, but nevertheless it's what he's working at. We have uninterrupted space, big space for the laboratories, by having a Vierendal truss, you can see them there, which is big enough for a man to walk in to handle all the equipment is up there. And so you can have a completely unimpeded space, and believe me, it is packed with equipment like an egg. It's solid with equipment down below. And those big trusses. Now, the very first drawing that Kahn did of it, when they still weren't quite sure what the structure was going to be, but it was the same intention, had the studies in a very different shape. You notice what it is? It's a fan pattern coming out from the center, making these four pie-shaped figures facing flat side out. Now, that is was directly traced by Jim Vreeland, one of the people in this office, from this building on the Capitol line on the Palatine Hill in Rome. It's part of the Domus Augustanus, so-called. It's the Flavian Palace of the second half of the 1st century A.D. by the great Roman Baroque architect Rabirius. Right? And Brown loved it, and Kahn had loved it, and he's directly looking at it. This is the first time one sees him using directly a Roman form. I loved it too. I took that picture not knowing that Kahn had ever looked at it in 1952. It was taken for me by a man named Johannes Felbermayr, who'd been a chauffeur in the German Archaeological Institute in Rome. He was Jewish, and he'd been saved, like more than 100 other Jews, by the great director Ludwig Curtius, who kept them there, and he kept them hidden, and when people came from Berlin, they were out of sight, and he saved their lives. It's interesting because finally he was sent to the Eastern Front because the Italian archaeologists wanted to have Rome in antiquity have 1 million people in it. And today everybody thinks they probably did have 1 million people, but at that time Curtius didn't believe it. And he kept attacking them, saying it couldn't have had 1 million people. He did all kinds of obsessive studies to show that the river system wasn't enough and the roads weren't wide enough in view of the size of the cars to get enough wheat in to feed them. And the Wilhelmstrasse kept telling down, let them have as many people as they want. Just shut up, leave them alone, stop it. And he wouldn't. They sent the Eastern Front. But he survived. He came back. And he was the director for a while after the war. And this Felbermayr, who'd been there and been through all that, was with me up there while the Italians down below were rioting about Trieste or something. That's what the point was. And they were roaring. And I'll never forget this man saying, La bestia umana, the human animal. And that's really true. You felt it groaning down below. Same old thing. Hate. Anyway, it was a great spot. And then now look, you go from that in the late and to the early 2nd, and you get Hadrian, I talked about last time, with a fanning pattern of columns in that central island of his. And then more than that, you get a Choisy drawing of Hagia Sophia, where you have a square bay and a dome above it on pendentives, and as you look up from below, you see it's a fanning pattern. And don't say you have steel, you do it on the flat, as Pier Luigi Nervi was doing in his, right that moment, right those very days, I saw this in Bologna. You see it's the same thing, square, what he called the pattern of the moment of bending, where he's got the flanges, he's got steel in there. And even Frank Lloyd Wright was using it at that time in this unbending for his Greek Orthodox Church. Then, but however, it wasn't built because that form drawing was then deformed by the fact that Kahn decided all those people had a view of the sea, of the Pacific. So he turned it like that. You can just see him looking like this. He turns it, and what he wants to see is this. And it's a beautiful view. It's the Pacific. And there's a handwriting school down there out of sight. So every once in a while, Icarus just goes right across like that. It's really wonderful. And that concrete, close the door, please. That concrete is beautiful. It's like marble. And you see, everything's looking that way. So when you're in that space, everything is being pushed that way. And that's why Barragan suggested to Louis that you could get that feeling. Louis Barragan, it's the only suggestion Louis ever took from anybody that I ever knew. You could do it with one drop of water, starting it in the middle of the space and having it go that way. It would also add you, because Kahn wanted something else. You get this great view. It's as if it's all marble. It's all a marble acropolis. What Kahn wants is the sense that the whole continent is coming down into this place and is pushing to that view. So his original idea, his original idea was that he would bring in the forest that he planted on that side, and where Salk, before he died, ruined the whole thing with another building on it. And you see, he pulls it in, as if it's being pulled, as if it's pushing those walls. And Barragan said, no, you can do it much more simply just with the water, as you saw. But it is fascinating. He really wanted the forest pushing like this. So then he projects here a community center, which unfortunately Salk never builds. He has a pile of rubble there. This community center has theaters and classrooms and so on, and also has for the first time Kahn's ruins wrapped around buildings. You see, you have buildings like this, which are all glass, and Kahn says to protect them from the sun, which is pure reason to do it, not the reason he wants to do it all, which will have no glass in them at all. No glass. Pure ruins. Like that. And you can see it like this. Like this. He's building two walls. You see where he has a circular room, he has a square. These shapes all derive from Hadrian's Fill. I talked to you about that before. And also from Irving Gill, I talked to you about working here. And that's what he gets. And he gets a beautiful thing. And notice how he does it. And I think the reason he does it is because of that drawing on the right. That's of 1956. And it was in the Memoirs of the American Academy in Rome. And a man named Edwin Daisley Thatcher did studies of the forum baths at Ostia. And he decided, and this is one of his many drawings, he decided that the hypocaust in the floor and the orientation, he shows you where the sun will be on the longest day of the year, meant that these never had glass. They didn't have to have glass. Now the archaeologists think that they did have glass, but he wrote this article proving to his own satisfaction that they did not have glass. Then they were published in architectural magazines in 1958. They were well known to Louis. Frank Brown was not responsible for this. He wasn't at the Academy that day, but it's a very important image. You see, Kahn is really echoing it here. But he doesn't have the thick Roman walls. He has very thin walls. And he's going to have marble in those flat spaces between the flanges. Very thin, but see, stiffened, as it were. Looks like Nervi's vaults, actually, with the flanges here that stiffen by circles. But it was when I was writing about Kahn, this is the last of his drawings, the most recent of his drawings I'd seen, it convinced me that he was really a great architect of the kind. Who would imagine there'd be a form like this, a great Roman form like this, in 1960? Nobody. And you see, the Romans get it with thick walls, how wonderful that turning cylinder is with the void. But he does it with very thin, Corbusian thin walls over there. And it would have looked more or less like this. And everybody said Looney Lou. They called him Looney Lou in Philadelphia. Anyway, he said, you can't build two buildings. You can't build two sets of walls. You can't build a wall like that. But Louis had the last laugh on him because he got all those buildings in India where he didn't need glass. And this is the Indian School of Management at Dhaka. And there you have the great circle braced against earthquake. They told him they had earthquakes there, so he had a wonderful chance to brace it into this thing. And you see what you have here. This is really the stairwell and the hall, that's all it is, of a triangular building going back on the other side, which has the dormitories. It's dormitories. There's rooms on the other side, and there you see all that is that. And what it is, it's what Bloom in his literary criticism would call a misreading, a purposeful misreading of the way Roman brick and concrete construction goes. And it goes like this. The mason comes along and he builds up two walls of brick, maybe about this high. Then he forces the concrete in. It's not really liquid, it's gelatinous. He forces it in like that. Then he builds up some more, and then he forces it in. And he goes until he gets over the window and he puts in a wooden lintel. And then so that the weight of the mass above it will not press on that lintel until after it hardens, he builds a relieving arch that goes right through the wall. It goes on both sides of the wall. It goes through like this. You see it here. Then when the concrete comes in, that directs it away from the thing, and the whole thing hardens. And that's what he does here. So this lintel is protected by this, but Louis turns it around. And he has the lintel holding that thing back. You really feel that concrete tie almost singing with tension as that arch pushes like that. It's really wonderful. And this is at Dhaka, and you see it holds it like that. And then it's wonderful that he takes the Romans in such structures as at Trajan's Market will put a big block of travertine right here where a lot of forces come together. He puts a concrete block. And this slice, which makes you feel that it's holding that back. Imagine if that weren't there, that would look inert. Tight like that, but you feel it. That too is under pressure. It really brings it alive. Now it's fascinating that, see, Corbusier is doing almost the same thing. Just a few years before, at Chandigarh. Corbusier, it's true, is more Greek in background, more the body, the empathy. Kahn's is more Roman. Another Kahn may be more Indian too, because if you look at this, you take the greatest Indian monument, take the Taj Mahal. Now Louis is doing exactly what it does, giving you a flat front, which you cut back into like that, so that wonderful Indian sun can model it. Look at it, it goes in there. And the other thing is, also in the center, there's a cylinder. And the Taj Mahal is dramatized by the fact that he cuts deepest under the cylinder. Kahn lets the cylinder come, but you see it's the same thing. But then he doesn't cover it with all the beautiful marble. Leaves it primitive, a beginning, a ruin. He won't go past the ruin. And it's as ruins that they sort of dance across the landscape, like this. The plan is, I think, fascinating. You see, you're looking, if you take the right slant up there, you're looking at those ends, and the rooms you see are behind them. Then you come around and you have another type. The stairway is different. Then behind it you get really almost the University of Virginia concealed. You get a basic shape up here, which is more or less the library. You have a cross structure here, but you have a kind of semi-open court. You have classrooms here on both sides. It's not as clear and it's full of stuff. It's this wonderful rhythm of these things and these crazy things. That other type is even more startling than this one. Looks like the great proboscis of some strange animal comes out. And it contains the stairs. Then behind them are those great circles. Looking in, you don't know what you're looking into. And again, this is where you feel how important not only the ruin, but Piranesi is. Piranesi, you see, who took the ruins and made them so full of life that all architects began to grow from them, and that modern architecture really began with Piranesi in the 18th century. This is the Piranesi view of a bridge. So you've got a circle coming down into a foundation, so it seems to be braced, but it's a circle like this, but it's braced, and Kahn says, oh, that's great, you see, he can brace his own circles because of that threat of earthquake. And Piranesi is very important to him with that sense of the sublime, a sense of something which is full of awe and grandeur. And it's not old-fashioned beauty, it's something more primitive, something more tragic. And you get these great views. This is under the campus marshes, a Roman ruin. You see ways the arch come right down to the ground. and the changes of light. Well, that's what Kahn does. As I've showed you already in these cryptoportici, this one is at Dhaka. He has them in blood. The Romans have these underground passageways in the heat. Hadrian has a lot of them. And they're perfect for India. You go underground, but then he does this, like Piranesi, when you're in a great cathedral, strange, disquieting place, primitive and powerful. It's really wonderful. You really feel that built like this. And actually, in that book of mine, Modern Architecture, that you're reading, in the beginning of the decade, which ends with these on the left like this, I showed the Piranesi up above, you see, and showed how Soane and the other architects of the late 18th century picked that up, same kind of thing. And that sense of the sublime goes right through modern architecture, and the awe and the terror and the mass world and all that kind of thing. And it comes to a great building by Nervi up above, or the Reichskongress in Nuremberg down below. And the Germans, when they published it, they took that out. They would not reproduce that Nazi building. But of course, awe, terror, mass world, same thing I'm talking about. And then the architect, you see, it all shows in the eye of the architect. The new seer is the architect. And Ledoux does that drawing there of one of those spaces shown in his eye. And Kahn builds the eye. This is the outpatient clinic at Dhaka, the hospital at Dhaka. And it's supposed to be open there. There's supposed to be no glass up above. But when they had the war with China, they had so many casualties that they had to have more wards, so they filled it up. And you see what you get. You get, really, it's like a Greek porch out in front. And he has ties where he thinks he needs them or where he thinks they'll look well, holding it together. And at first, you don't see it all, or at least I didn't for a long time, that it really is the old circle in the square. The circle in the square, but because it's filled with glass, it's not so clear. But it's not clear anyway, because then Kahn hits it with the opposite, which is matter, pushing it, bracing it, pushing it. So you really read that, I think, more than the square, and these Roman impost blocks in it, like that. Fantastic thing, but it's the eye. And then behind it, what it lights into is a very humane program. It's where the families wait. Because in India, apparently, if you have an outpatient, most of the families come with them, and they wait with them. Sometimes they have to wait a long time. And so the doctor's offices are back there, and this is all public space right here. But look how much, like this, look how much it's a little Roman store, a little Roman hot drink stand at Ostia right here, the thermopolium for hot drinks. It's like that with the light coming in strange sides, same way with the columns, same way, and the sense of the ruin. Now, it's interesting the way one can conceive of a ruin, what to do with it. Remember, the 20th century has made more ruins with its wars than any other ruins were ever made before. So it's always had a love of ruins, and this love of ruins, see, it predates our wars. It's almost as if you feel the ruin is there. Now, say, the ruin that Brown loved almost best, and Kahn did too, was the Basilica in Trajan's Market above his farm, where you had wholesale trading in commodities. That's what it amounts to. It was a center, distributing place in Rome. And you see up above you have the cross vaults with the flying vaults, buttresses you notice out there, which bring light in from above. So you have a tunnel vault going this way and cross tunnels coming this way. The feeling is that they're lifting like that Roman lifting. Now, what McKinley & White does with those is what the Romans did. Put Greek columns underneath them, looking as if they're holding them down, and you get this great Pennsylvania station. What Louis does is to reduce them even more. He reduces, makes them more primitive. He has steel, so he can have a flat concrete slab up above instead of the arch. But it's basically the same conformation that he does in one of those rooms there in Dhaka. Or again, you can go to, for example, the temple of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, Capitolinus at Ostia. And every Roman colony like this has a temple of Jupiter over the forum, like this. You see what you've got? You've got marble steps. You've got an accent of erosion that's giving you two flat planes to the front entrance. You can see back in there, in the wall, there are niches which show on the outside of the wall as the relieving arches which make them inside. You take that, and it makes the great assembly building at Dhaka. This enormous building, the same. There are the marble columns, There's the front and two flat slabs, the hole in between, and there are the shapes in the wall. Now those shapes in the wall, of course, are really wonderful. They derive from all these wonderful spaces that they have inside, where you have some of them here, as they're at the entrance right there. You get mosques in there. You get other subsidiary halls. You get offices. You get all kinds of things. And then back in here is the main meeting space, which is lighted from above. As we'll see in a moment. You come down like that. Now you can find every one of those shapes in Kahn's work there in this map, which hung behind his desk in his office in Philadelphia. And it's a fantastic restoration of the campus marshes, the old Roman campus marshes down there by the Tiber, by Piranesi. And all these wonderful shapes, you see them here, they're all Piranesi, they're all fancy. There really is no archaeological evidence really for any of this. They're all here. You find in one case or another. And when a client would come up to see Kahn, and Kahn would never admit to people he didn't know that he worked with Rome. There's a very nice archaeologist at the American Academy who said at a cocktail party to Kahn one day, it's wonderful the way you're bringing the Roman arch back to life. And Kahn snapped. Kahn said the Romans didn't have a patent on the arch. And he was a modern architect. He couldn't admit it except if you knew it. And if you knew it, he knew it, and there it was right behind his desk. But it's very odd. It's very strange. And you see the wonderful shapes that you get like this. But notice all those shapes come elsewhere. For example, I was with him once in Leningrad. He bought this book. It's the second volume of this he bought. It's an English book of castles, which showed thick walls with high parallel or circular shapes in them. But in thick walls, like that. The hollow is in the wall. Now, Kahn takes the wall, makes it very thin, puts the shape in it, and it's because of the layering of the wall with another behind it that you get the volume between two walls, and the walls can stay just as thin as Corbusier. Then he threads through them with marble, like this, some of which pops out. It always looks as if it's not going to really stay there. Makes it kind of wonderfully valuable, this whole thing. He makes a strange jewel of a building, and in the great Indian way, as you saw before, it's reflected in that tank, that water. And then it's almost like this. There are these housing projects coming like this at them, and they're more primitive. It's circular forms in brick, and you don't know what's behind those strange openings in them. And Rossi exploits this in a wonderful tomb he does, I'll talk about later, where he has the Roman ruin, but then he has the whole Roman gate at Verona inside. Kahn won't do that. He's like Moses. He never quite goes to never quite to the promised land. Inside he has just the geometry of the pediment, I think. And all of it always here, always a Piranesi touch. Now, I won't finish because it's time for evaluation. Is that right? That's what you're here for. Okay, come on. I'll finish it next time.